All right, here we go. We have Bakari Sellers in the building, son of legendary civil rights activist Cleveland Sellers, the youngest African-American ever elected as an official at the age of 22, and the author of the new book, My Vanishing Country.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, man. It's an honor to be here with you. I've always admired your platform and your work. And so this is awesome to be able to utilize this just to talk about everything that's going on in the world and some of the things that I'm doing.
Absolutely. And before we start with your story, I really want to focus on your father's story.
Yeah.
Now, he actually received a graduate degree from Harvard.
Correct.
And during the civil rights movement, he was actually a very prominent voice. And there was a situation called the Orangeburg Massacre in South Carolina State University. So tell me exactly what happened there.
So, I'm actually glad you started off with this Harvard degree. You got a graduate degree from Harvard. It was a unique story leading up to that because my father got started in the movement in 1955 around the death of Emmett Till. And that sparked his passion. That sparked something within him to lead marches and sit-ins. And his family, my grandparents, they were middle class back in the 50s and early 60s, and they didn't want to. They felt they were worried about his safety, but they were also worried about their economic safety, and they were also worried about his safety. So they sent him to Howard University. And when he got to Howard, he befriended a man named Stokely Carmichael. Stokely graduated from Howard and then convinced this young man to drop out of school. He joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and in February of 1968, he became involved in the most deadly civil rights demonstration this country's ever seen. On the night of the 6th, the students from South Carolina State went down to the All-Star Bowling Alley and began to protest and clap and chant. State troopers and city police, they beat many of the students that night, but not with normal police batons. They beat them with batons that were about this long. And at the end, they had these leather rawhide whips. The students that night, they had to go back and heal not only their physical wounds, but their mental wounds and emotional wounds as well. Then came February 7th, 1968. And I think the saying is the tension was so thick that you could cut it with a knife, but nothing happened. Then came that fateful day of February 8th, 1968, when the students went back to the bowling alley. But this time when law enforcement came, they got the right idea and they went back to their campus. They went back to their campus and they built this huge bonfire, but they couldn't foresee what would happen next. They didn't foresee that South Carolina State troopers would line up along the embankment in front of their beloved campus. They didn't foresee that they would close ranks like they did. They didn't foresee that they would have shotguns that were loaded with deadly double-aught buckshots or the same bullets we use to hunt deer. And they didn't foresee it would be turned on them with deadly intent. And for 8 seconds, shots were fired into the crowd. It wounded 28. My father was shot that night. I killed 3, Henry Smith, Samuel Hammond, and Delano Middleton. The story of my father is not over at that moment, though. He went to the infirmary to get his wound checked out. They told him there was nothing they could do for him there. He had to go to the hospital. And when he got to the hospital, he was arrested. He was arrested and charged with 5 felony counts, looking at a maximum of 75 years in prison. In between the night of February 8th, 1968 and the day of my father's trial, all 8 non-officers who fired shots into the group of students were tried. They were all found not guilty. And my father went to trial. The lead investigator said that he had misplaced all the evidence, but he did remember my father standing on top of a fire truck, not on the night of the 8th, but on the night of the 6th, lighting a Bic and saying, "Burn, baby, burn." And so his indictment was backdated from February 8th to February 6th. And he was charged, tried, and convicted of rioting. He became the first and only one-man riot in the history of this country. And my family's story is one that's rooted in that trauma and that pain. And my sister's middle name is Abademe. It means born while father's away, because my sister was actually born while my father was in prison. And there's this pretty cool picture of my sister with the big afro and my mom with a big afro, my dad with a big afro, and my dad's holding my sister in his arms on the prison yard. The picture was taken by another inmate, and that was the first time that my dad was able to lay eyes on his daughter. And his involvement with the movement is what pushes me to be so active in my pursuit for justice today.
Well, your dad was actually on death row at one point.
They housed him on death row. When they denied his bond, he was housed on death row. So after the night of February 8th, they actually blocked off the entire interstate between Orangeburg, South Carolina, and Columbia, South Carolina, about 40 miles. Everyone who was on, they pushed off, and no one was allowed on the interstate. And when they denied his bond, they housed him on death row. They later gave him a $50,000 bond in 1968. So you can imagine how difficult that was. And so I've been to that prison. I'll share a story with you. I've been to that prison not once but twice. The first time my father took me in to see James Brown, who was a good friend of his. And James wouldn't let me see him because his hair wasn't done. And he didn't want any young people seeing him like that. So my father sent me back out to the car. We parked the car along the fence line under a tree. So I sat in there with the windows cracked for a couple of hours while my father met with James. And then the second time I went was when they were about to tear that prison down, and I got a chance to see my father's death row cell, which is surreal. Just seeing where on the row where your father was housed, because they deemed him to be an outside agitator, so they tried to break him.
How much time did he ultimately serve?
He got sentenced to a year. He ended up doing 7 months of hard labor. He'll tell you today, though, that because there was no investigation, I mean, Vlad, I think it's fair to say he's still serving that time in his head because, he's the only person who was ever imprisoned as a result of that night's violence. He was the scapegoat. The state never had an investigation. All the officers have been free. And the tragedy in this whole story is, like, you've never heard of this story. Most of the country's never heard of this story. And it's the most deadly civil rights demonstration in this country's history. You know about Kent State, where the kids are white, but we don't know about South Carolina State. And so even in my book, I just try to lift up those voices and lift up those forgotten and unheard voices.
Well, and then 25 years later, he actually got a full pardon.
And the irony in that is that my partisan politics are all types of screwed up in my head because my dad actually, the reason that all of that incident occurred was because of a Democratic governor in 1968 in South Carolina, a Republican governor in 1990, in the early 90s in South Carolina, pardoned my father. And so I say partisanship is no true indication of justice. But, we've, as a family, and then imagine this, though. I mean, think about, your dad being arrested unjustly and the struggles of a family. I mean, you have a Black man getting out of prison with a felony on his record in the South, trying to raise a young family. That was extremely difficult. And it was difficult on my mom, who's a real hero, for having to be the breadwinner, for having to be the person who kept the family together while her husband was in jail. And so I just, when I talk about the Black experience, I just outline the pain and trauma, the triumph as well, the pride as well. But I want people to understand that pain as well.